Well, friends, welcome to another Tuesday night conversation. This is where we speak with real people over real topics. These are real conversations. And my name's Brian, and it's just great to be able to host this again. Tonight, we have a wonderful guest. I was so thrilled that he agreed to come and speak to us and have this conversation. He's been to our church. He's spoken to us. And he's just a great guy, a wonderful and amazing author, written many, many books. Many of you have probably read some of his books. And so I'm just thrilled to welcome and introduce to you Philip Yancey. So here he is. Here's Philip. Thanks so much, Philip, for joining us tonight.
Well, it's good to be back, in a virtual sense anyway. I didn't have to make that long trip out there, but it is good to be connected with you again, Brian.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I was so thrilled that you would say yes, and that we can meet in this way. You know, the Lord has gone before us, and thankful for technology and easy technology that I can actually use, and we can have this conversation.
Right.
Philip, I wanted to talk about several different things with you tonight. As much as we can get through, we'll see. But maybe could we start just by you sharing a little bit of your testimony, like what led you to the Lord, and what did that journey look like for you?
You hear testimonies of people who were saved from alcohol or drugs or a wild lifestyle, and mine is not that at all. I would actually say I was saved from church. It was not a healthy church. It was back in the South in pre-civil rights days. It was a racist, angry, fundamentalist, real tiny, almost like a sect church. We took life very seriously. We thought that heaven was going to be a very small place. There were about 100 of us in that congregation, and maybe heaven would have 120, 150 people, but surely no more. You know, we had the truth. And then I went through a period when I realized that some of the things they told me were just flat out wrong. Certainly the teaching on racism was wrong. And that was a crisis of faith for me. I wondered if they're wrong about that. Maybe they're wrong about the Bible. Maybe they're wrong about Jesus. And so I went on my own exploration, and in a sense, I've been doing that ever since, Brian. I was raised steeped in the Bible, steeped in religion,
Yeah.
and I've been privileged as a writer and as a person to go back and pick up those things one by one, look at them, study them, go to some sources that can really help me, and try to figure out where is the kernel here? What should I keep, and what did people just kind of add on to the faith that I need to discard?
Yeah, that's excellent. You know, for many of us, we use Philip Yancey books to help us in our devotional life, and it helps us in our journey of faith. What does Philip Yancey do in your devotional life? What does that look like, just your kind of ongoing walk with Jesus?
I go with the old kind of InterVarsity type quiet time in the morning. It's the first thing I do. Well, it's the second thing I do. First, I make some coffee, right? And then I take my coffee upstairs. I have a special little sitting area and spend about an hour.
Yeah.
Usually it's meditating on one or two chapters, sometimes a Christian book. And frankly, with this lockdown, I've rediscovered poetry. That's one thing I do. I pick up a book of poems, and they make you slow down. They make you really meditate as you read. And I found that's been a good practice. And then I spend time in prayer. So it takes me about an hour. And when I'm really busy, I'm tempted to say, well, I'll skip that. That'll give me an extra hour's work.
Yes.
Never works out. That day is a disaster. And I find if I carve out that time, it just gets the day off to a good start, and it turns out being more efficient in the long term.
Yeah. We one of the things that we encourage folks here at Walnut Hill is what we call the first 20. And it's the first 20 minutes of your day spent with Jesus. And
I like that.
Place to start. Some folks do 30, 40, 50. You know, it tends to increase as you spend more time with Jesus, but we love that early morning. We often say if you start your day with Jesus, you're more prone to walk the rest of the day with Jesus.
Yeah.
Later, I feel like for me personally, when I go to him later, it's for recovery, not for filling.
Yeah. And that's one thing I really have to work at. it's not a healthy thing, I think, just to keep God in a box, whether it's a Sunday morning box or if it's a 20 minutes in the morning box.
Right.
The trick is being conscious of God's presence throughout the day. I used to have a watch, a digital watch, and I would set my alarm so it would ring every hour in the hour, and I would stop and think, okay, let me kind of recommit myself, because it's important for me to be prepared when a phone rings, when somebody unexpected shows up at the door, not to view that as an interruption, but to view that as an opportunity. And the only way I can do that is to ask God to keep reminding me of that throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I wanted to raise some of the books you've written and ask a few questions. And you've written many books. I've picked some of my favorites, and
Okay.
wanted to kind of chat with you about some of them, starting with The Jesus I Never Knew.
Uh-huh.
And in that book, you talk quite a bit about rediscovering Jesus. And you share
Right.
your testimony here too, a little bit about that. Can you go a bit
Right.
further about that this time in your life where you discovered Jesus wasn't exactly who you thought he was?
Yes. I guess my view of Jesus growing up was a Sunday school view. And in one place, maybe in that book, I described him as Captain Kangaroo with a beard. So Captain Kangaroo isn't on TV anymore, so you have to be of a certain generation to understand that. But this genial, wonderful guy who would take children, put them on his lap, and pat them on the back, and that is part of what Jesus. He loved children, and whenever he was around them, he emphasized how important they were and would take them on his lap. But when I started reading the Gospels for myself, I saw a different side of Jesus. He was unpredictable. He could be fierce at times. He was brave. He would call politicians names if he didn't approve of their behavior. He was hard to pin down. I read somewhere, I think it was in one of Brennan Manning's books, he said there were 183 times when somebody came to Jesus and asked a direct question. And best he could figure, of those 183 times, 3 times Jesus gave a direct answer.
Yeah, that's right.
Usually he would toss the question back or tell a story or just kind of evade the question. He wasn't an arm twister. The people I grew up among were always trying to get you to come forward and repent your sins and do all this stuff. I was always shadowed by guilt. And Jesus didn't do that. He said, this is a truth, and it's up to you whether you accept it or not. And if a rich young ruler would walk away, rejecting him, Mark says he loved him anyway.
Right.
He didn't say, oh, wait, you don't have to give away all your money. How about 10%? Start there. That's what we would do. But not Jesus. He was he was an enigma. He was full of surprises. And later, I realized that Jesus was speaking kind of with 2 different voices. To the people who are in power, and those could be politically people or the religious professionals in his day. He could be pretty tough. He would call them incendiary names. You look at the way he treated the Pharisees. The Pharisees were kind of Bible believers of their day, and Jesus really challenged them because they were missing the whole point. But to the people who were oppressed or marginalized or outcast in any way, either morally or physically through a handicap, he always responded with comfort and compassion. And once I kind of understood that, I had a feeling of what Jesus was like. He was one person, but he adapted his style to the kind of people he was dealing with at the moment.
That's so good. We're in a year right now that we've been calling Ignite Compassion. And we've been focusing on compassion. And we did a whole sermon series called The Red Letters, which was on the words of Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
And, is there anything that you'd be able to say into Jesus as compassion, or just a revelation of Jesus in how he was a person of compassion and what that means for us today?
Yes. When I wrote that book, I realized that I got most of my opinion of Jesus from the Apostle Paul, not from Jesus himself. And the Apostle Paul is a brilliant theologian, and he soars as he describes the cosmic Christ who's going to bring everything under himself. And, that's true. I'm not questioning that at all. But when I went back and read the Gospels, I rediscovered the human side of Jesus. He was moved with compassion, that very strong Greek word. Yeah. He was moved in his bowels. And he didn't do his healings in most cases. He was kind of reluctant. He would tell people, don't tell anybody I did this. He's not trying to attract attention. In fact, he was trying to get away from the crowds. Very often he'd get into a boat, he'd go away. But when he was around someone or around even a crowd, he sensed their need and would respond at great personal cost. I imagine how I have a little clue of what it was like for Jesus to just be surrounded by these multitudes and human need. And he was moved. And when his friends were suffering, he wept. We know of 3 times at least, the Gospels tell us, that Jesus cried. He was touched by human misery. He was identifying with his people who were being oppressed as part of the Roman Empire at the time. And compassion just described him. I have the feeling Jesus didn't go through a day like most of us do. I turn on my computer, I look at the Microsoft calendar of things I've got to do today. Yeah. And if anything interferes with that, well, that's an interruption. I don't think Jesus had a list of things I've got to do today. He just started walking, started talking, and the crowds would come, the sick would come, and Jesus would deal with them. So in a sense, compassion was his things I've got to do today, responding to the human need that he ran into.
Yeah, it's like his agenda was to bring the kingdom. And
yes.
Whatever came to him, he was going to do that. And
yes.
I think sometimes what keeps us from discovering the real Jesus or the Jesus we never knew are our doubts. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we can grow up in a world where doubts are not okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about maybe, is there health with doubts? Is this part of the journey to discovering who Jesus really is?
Yes. For those people who think doubts are not okay, I would just say, read the Bible. Sometimes I'm invited to university settings or college settings, and I'll be speaking to a group of skeptics who aren't believers, and I'll say something like this. I dare you, I challenge you to find any argument against God in the great atheists like David Hume, Voltaire, or the modern versions, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. I dare you to find any argument that they use that's not already included in the Bible, right. In the book of Lamentations, Job, many of the Psalms, almost half of the Psalms. And then I'll say, I don't know about you, but I have respect for a God who not only allows us to doubt, but actually gives us the words that we can use to doubt. I respect a God like that. I love the story of the way Jesus handled doubt. As we know, there were 12 disciples and one committed suicide, Judas, so there are 11 left. And evidently 10 of them had encountered the risen Jesus after the resurrection, but one of them wasn't there when that happened. Right. Thomas, doubting Thomas. And finally, Jesus did appear. Now, interestingly, Jesus only tended to appear, the resurrected Jesus, to small groups of people who already believed in him. He didn't show up on Pilate's porch or somewhere and, here, I'll show you, you were wrong. He went to the people who already believed in him.
Yes.
So here was this group of people, including Thomas at this point, and Jesus showed up, just boom, there he was, walked through the door. And I love the tender way that Jesus treated him. He didn't scold him. He didn't say, why didn't you be like the rest of these guys? Don't you believe anything? He would say, okay, Thomas, what proof do you need? Do you want to feel my scars? Do you want me to eat something for you? So that was one thing that struck me. And the other thing that struck me, Brian, is that here Thomas, he was the first heretic, really. He refused to believe the most important doctrine of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus. And yet, the other 10 invited him in with them into that room. And I think that's something the church could learn from. There are people who need the church who aren't ready for it. Yeah. And the church can be a safe place for those who need more light, like Thomas. Yeah. And I frankly, am a great advocate of doubt. It's when I started doubting some of the things my church told me that put me on a spiritual quest to find who that Jesus was for myself. And I would challenge anybody to go on that quest. And there are a lot of resources available. And there are a lot of people that we can learn from and look to as models of what a Christ-like, a Jesus-like life looks like.
Yeah, that's great. I think another thing that maybe keeps us from seeing Jesus for who he really is, and I hear this as a pastor a lot of times, I'm sure we all hear this, is, man, I can't get on board with your Jesus because of Christ followers who don't model.
Yeah.
Or I have a really hard time understanding the love of God when I didn't have a loving earthly father.
Mm.
Can you talk to us a little bit about maybe some help on how people can discover this real Jesus, even if they've been hurt by a Christ follower or hurt by a father figure? How do we discover who Jesus really is when we have these big hangups and real hangups?
I would say they should become a writer. That's my story. I grew up without a father. My father died when I was 1 year old, back in the polio epidemics. We're all talking about the coronavirus now. Back then it was polio, which was killing 50,000 people a year in the United States and paralyzing and damaging many more. My father was one of those. He died at the age of 23. Yeah. So I never knew him. I have no memories at all of my father. And that played out. My mother never remarried, so we were always raised in poverty, and a lot of stories about that. And I didn't have a father figure. Providentially, when I was an adult and just starting to write, I was writing the book, Where is God When It Hurts? I came across this man, Dr. Paul Brand, and we ended up writing 3 different books together and spent almost 10 years on and off as I was going around the world, and it was great. A lot of people, when they grow up, they have to go through this individuation thing where they separate from their father and overcome that and then kind of reconnect. And I got to choose my own father as an adult, so I didn't have to go through all that. And he was a very saintly, wise, brilliant man, and became an anchor to my faith. Yeah. But I know how hard that is. I remember talking to a young woman who said she was going to a spiritual director at the time, a counselor, and she said, every time I'm in church and they pray this prayer, Our Father, I just grimace inside, because her father had abused her sexually. And she went on and expressed her anger about the images that come up when she hears that word, Father. And the counselor just kind of leaned back and said, honey, you need to fire that God. If that's your idea of God, get rid of it, start over. And if that is your idea of God, and a different version of that was my idea of God, and that was the cosmic policeman in the sky trying to smash us if we're trying to enjoy life. Right. There is a solution, and the solution, I'll give you the fancy version. It comes from a British archbishop. He said, in God is no unChristlikeness at all. Mm-hmm. In God is no unChristlikeness at all. And that's a fancy way of saying, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Yeah. That's why he came. He's the express image of the invisible God. And if my image of God does not match up with Jesus, if there's a disconnect there, I got a problem. Yeah. I need to somehow see what God is like through Jesus. Jesus came to show us what God is like, full of surprises, and then also what we should be like. That's why he came, and that's what we can learn from him. Yeah. That's so good, and it really answers the question, why Jesus, too. Hmm. Not only did he come to go to the cross, so instrumental for our faith, to die for our sins, but he came to show us who the Father is, what it's like. And that's such good advice, Philip, to look to Jesus. Spend time with Jesus. You're gonna know the Father's heart for you and for us. Let's talk a little. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, God is invisible, and it's really hard to come up with some lasting picture. You know, you go to the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and God looks like an old man, much like Adam, but just with long hair and a beard.
Yeah.
And we know that's not what God is like. God is the God of the universe.
Yeah.
But how do you conceptualize that? I think God, knowing we wouldn't be able to do that, I will send my image. I will send a picture of who I am, not just a representation, but the actual fact of who I am. And it's such a different picture than we would come up with on our own, or even come up with in our theology books. You know, they start out with omnipotence and omnipresence, and all those things are true, but how do they relate to me as a human being on planet Earth with flesh, you know, and with a body? And God said, okay, I'll show you what I am like in the kind of form that you can grasp and understand and shake hands with and debate and argue with and crucify. It's an unbelievable leap that God took by sending his son to become one of us.
Yeah. You can't help but be moved by who God is when you look at Jesus. You see Jesus shock his disciples over and over again.
Yeah, right.
He did. And really, they weren't catching that he was expressing the Father's heart, you know. He washed their feet. I mean, is there anything more incredible that our God would do that? And I often say, if you were in that circle that day, he would have washed your feet too. And it's shocking. It's absolutely amazing that's who our God is. So I love that advice to look to Jesus, to rediscover or to continue to discover who God is. Let's talk a little bit about another area of work that you've done, and the book is called "What is So Amazing About Grace?" And I'd love for us just to talk a little bit about grace, and maybe this is a good transition, talking about many people have this idea of who God is. He's judgmental. He's throwing down thunderbolts from heaven. He sees only the bad we do. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you start your book by talking about this word ungrace. I don't know if many people have heard unless they've read the book. Can you talk to us a little bit about ungrace first?
Well, that's actually fairly easy right now because our whole society is infected with ungrace. It's a judgmental, divisive, adversarial society. And my goodness, that happens in individuals. It happens in families. Often another coined word, unforgiveness, is a part of that. I know this very personally. There are only 3 people in my family: my mother, my brother, and I. My brother and my mother haven't spoken in 50 years. And there's that wall. Here they are, they share DNA, but something that happened 50 years ago is still haunting them and still keeping them apart. And that's true of families. It's true often within a marriage. Nobody's willing to take that first step and say, I was wrong, I was sorry. Yeah. And it's true in nations. So many wars even are started by something that happened 400, 500 years ago. Yeah. And yet that ungrace, that spirit of ungrace still characterizes the relationship between these people and those people. Yeah. And certainly we're seeing it today with the racial divide. You know, ungrace starts when we have a ranking system.
Yes.
These people are better than those people. And our society does that. Every society does that. And frankly, the Christian church can do that as well. Yeah. Because when you look at the people Jesus was most fierce toward, they were the religious people. Yeah. Why? You know, why? What did Jesus have against the Pharisees? They're holier than most people. They keep all these 613 laws of the Old Testament, and they're quite proud of how much they give. And when you begin to think it's because of the things that I've done that God loves me, and actually I'm holier than thou. You know, a lot of people, when you ask them, what do you think about Christians? They don't like Christians. Why don't you like Christians? Well, they're morally superior. They judge me. They look down on me. They're holier than thou. And the message that Jesus brought clearly was, don't look to other people you're less holy than thou. There's only one thou. And none of us are going to make it by trying to climb a ladder to get God to like us. We've missed the whole point. God loves you as you are, just as I am, as the old hymn says. And unless you realize that, and sometimes it takes, I've learned from people who are addicted, for example, alcoholics who are forced to turn to God every day. And they go to these 12-step groups and they go through the steps. And one of them is, I can't make it on my own. I need help from a higher power. I need my fellow believers around me. And that applies directly to our church. And I think Jesus knew that the real poison is this poison of ungrace, where we start thinking, I'm better than you are, so I'm okay. Yeah. That's what the Pharisees didn't like. Jesus didn't seem to be keeping the laws nearly as stringently as they did. So they looked down on him. They eventually called for his death.
Yeah. Wow. So now if that's the idea of ungrace, then what's the concept of grace? And what's so amazing about this grace that we can receive?
When I was writing that book, I kept saying to myself, I need to come up with a definition. I'm writing a whole book about grace, so I need to define it. And I looked all through the Gospels, and frankly, I found nothing like a definition.
Yeah.
I found stories about a lost coin and the joy that was found when the woman found it. Stories about a lost sheep, where a shepherd would leave these 99 obedient sheep who did what they were supposed to do and showed up in the corral at night, and would risk going out into the dark where there are wild animals to save that one rebellious sheep.
Yeah.
And then he told a story about a family with two sons. One was a good, obedient son, and one was a prodigal son who squandered everything, wasted the family's inheritance, lived a profligate life. Who's the hero of all those stories? It's the prodigal son. And I actually went through, when I was writing Jesus I Never Knew, and made a list of the people Jesus encountered. And you can almost draw a line that the more good citizen, honorable, respectable people, they were the ones threatened by Jesus. They were hanging around trying to poke holes in him. It was the needy, the people who knew they were miserable failures, the moral outcasts, the physical outcasts, the prostitutes, the people like that. They were attracted to Jesus because they understood he had the living water that they needed to drink. He had that grace. And I wrote the book because the church isn't perceived by those people as a place you'd want to go. If your life is falling apart, when I talk to people whose lives are falling apart, I'll sometimes say, did you think about going to a church? And they look at me with shock. No, they would just make me feel worse, Right. And so we've missed that part. We do reach out in many cases, church, I'm sure your church reaches out to the needy around you, and so many churches have soup kitchens and work for the homeless. And I love seeing what's happening now in the midst of this virus pandemic. So many churches are reaching out and filling corners and little holes that the government isn't touching, reaching out to the unemployed and making food and visiting prisoners. The church has done that over the years. But even as you do that, it's tempting to think, oh, I'm morally superior because I'm doing this good thing, and to lose the fact that none of us deserve God's love. And I guess the closest thing to a definition that I came up with in writing the book was this phrase I used, that there's nothing that you can do to make God love you more. Going through these spiritual calisthenics, I read more of the Bible than you do. I know more verses than you do. I talk about my faith more freely than you do. That doesn't make God love you more. It pleases God. That doesn't make God love you more. And there's nothing really that you can do to make God love you less.
Right.
That was Jesus' point in reaching out to the people who were the least responsible people. God is love. God already loves you as much as an infinite God possibly can. He wants you to experience that love. And often that ranking of grace or of ungrace keeps people from receiving and understanding that.
Yeah. I'm thinking as you're talking about the story of the woman who enters in while Jesus is having a meal with Simon, and she washes his feet with her tears. And, you know, we don't know every bit of that story, what's happening, but it seems like she was obviously touched by Jesus, and now she's expressing out of what she's received. And the Simon character, though, is, a really good judge, an expert
Yeah, right.
at how much everybody is in debt and all these kind of things. And probably his pride in judging gets in the way of him actually receiving the grace that this woman had received. And she's just expressing like wholehearted worship of Jesus because she had received the grace of Jesus. At least that's what I imagine it. And so often I think we can get in the way of ourselves of really receiving that full gift of grace that Jesus has to offer us.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful scene, because you can imagine the fear and the shame, the courage that it took her. Here's this room full of VIPs, especially religious VIPs. She had the reputation as being one of the streetwalkers in that town. In Luke 7, it's pretty clear about that. And then she comes in and very provocatively loosens her hair and washes Jesus' feet, pours this expensive ointment. She was basically giving away her career. That's the most important thing she had in the way she made a living. She was pouring it away and trusting Jesus with her future. And the Pharisee says, if Jesus knew who that was, if he couldn't be a real prophet if he knew who this woman was. And of course, Jesus knew exactly who that woman was, and he was a real prophet. And that's one of the times when he takes on that Pharisee and just exposes him. He said, when I came in here, you didn't wash my feet. You didn't even shake my hand. You're here to judge me. This woman just gave everything that she had. And then he told the story about who forgives most.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful, that's the two voices right there. The voice of speaking to the one in power, looking down on others, and then Jesus' compassionate voice of understanding and lifting up the one who had been beaten down.
Yeah. You mentioned the prodigal son too. I want to share something with you and just get your response. See if I'm on to anything here.
Okay.
But when I look at the story of the prodigal son and really about the father character, and I see a picture of grace and how grace operates. And maybe this is a way that maybe we should take lesson on this, learn in our world today, even in terms of racism and all the divides that exist politically, socioeconomically. We can name a bunch, right?
Yeah.
When I look at the father, I see the father, it starts with him seeing. He sees his son coming back. And then he feels like his heart moves. He has compassion. And then he moves. He runs out and he meets the son, halfway up the driveway.
Yeah.
And to me, that seems like a picture of grace, almost like a progression of grace, and maybe even a progression for us to learn from on how to see restoration in some of these divisional lines. We need to see people. We need to feel and try to our best ability to feel what it's like to be in their shoes. And then we need to run out to the wounded, run out to the one who's in trouble, and meet them with love. But any comments or thoughts as I shared that?
I do like that, and it brings to mind another parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Where several people walked by, including the religious professionals, and they looked at this person in obvious need, lying in a ditch, bleeding, wounded, and they just walked past. They didn't want to mess with him, and they probably didn't even feel that compassion. This is another problem. I got a job to do here. I've got to go to the temple. And the Samaritan, the least likely person, because he was already an oppressed minority, looked out and saw, was moved, and then didn't just stop by being moved, acted. So I think that is a very valid progression. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, that's great. Well, maybe a couple more questions for you, Philip. Thanks again for sort of spending time with us.
Sure.
Another book you wrote is called Disappointment with God, and you walk through 3 questions that Christians you say wonder but seldom ask aloud, and
Right.
and this is God unfair? Is he silent? Is he hidden? We spent time looking at all of those, but I was wondering if we could focus on that last one. Is he hidden? And and if he's not, which I'm assuming that the answer is he's not hidden. If he's not, how do we find him? You know, here in New England and in our church, we have a lot of people who are really seeking the Lord. And so if God isn't hidden, you know, how do we find him?
When I was writing that book, I started at Genesis and went all the way through the Bible. In fact, in a 2-week period, I did nothing but read the Bible, trying to find out what's the plot here, what's the story behind a book that I thought I knew pretty well, but I had never really seen it as a broad sweep. One thing that struck me is that those questions, we'll take the hidden one, really didn't always exist. So, for example, when the Israelites were wandering in the Sinai wilderness for 40 years, I don't think anybody questioned about the existence of God. If there was an atheist, say, come up to a little Jewish girl and say, "You believe in God? I don't believe in God." And she might say, "Well, see that mountain over there? It's smoking. If you don't believe in God, just walk over and touch that mountain. And you will believe in God for 1 nanosecond right before you're incinerated." You know? There was startling evidence of God. The pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire that led them each day. And when Moses wanted instructions, he'd go into this tent of meeting. And when he'd come out, he'd be glowing. And people would say, "Put something on, put a mask on over your face. We can't look at you. You're just too bright." So God was not hidden. But the interesting thing is, we don't look upon that as a time of great faith. Actually, we look upon those 40 years as a time of irritation and grumbling and murmuring and lack of faith. And I see this progression, Brian. God was very visible, didn't get the results that we might think. And it was pretty hard to relate to a God like that. That's why they would send Moses in. "You go talk to him. You know, we can't talk to him. We can barely stand your sight when you come out of the tent." And then God did become visible on earth, and that's what Jesus was. Jesus, however, only worked, as far as we know, for about 3 years. And he didn't seem concerned about that. In fact, at the end, he said, "Well, it's finished. I've done my work." And it's actually good that I'm going away, he told the disciples, because I'm turning it over to you. And the only way people are going to know what God is like now is if you show them. And I'll give you a few hints, and that's when he washed their feet. And he says, if you really love each other, like we in the Trinity love each other, people are going to come to you. They're going to know what God is like. And that's a progression that I see. And I think it was an intentional progression. We're talking just after Pentecost. And that was a dramatic event. You know, even after the resurrection, there was 50 days there where nothing happened. The church didn't grow in that 50 days. The disciples were huddled. You know, some of them went fishing. They were meeting in this little tiny room. And then when Pentecost, when the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ came, then they went 3,000 people in one day, and they went back, and the whole movement started. And it's easy for us because we're people of bodies. We're bodily people, visible people. We have touch and all that. And we tend to think that's what's real. God is not. God is a spirit. And we keep wanting God to come down and act like one of us. You know, well, he did that for a time. But I don't think that's what God wants. I think God wants to communicate with us as spirit to spirit. That's what I understand. You've been writing a book on spiritual disciplines. That's what spiritual disciplines are all about. They're about coming to God on God's terms, not making God come to us on our terms. And the short answer to that question of where is God, if God is hidden today, God is in us.
Yeah.
That was, Paul called that the body of Christ. And I, with Dr. Brand, wrote 2 different books about that. Fearfully and Wonderfully was just released recently. And that's not just a metaphor, that's actually true.
Mm.
When Paul was making his living by persecuting Christians, you talk about an anti-Christian, he was killing and persecuting Christians, then he got knocked off his horse, and he doesn't know what happened. And he hears this voice, and it says, Paul, Saul, in those days, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
Mm.
Persecuting you? I wasn't persecuting you. I was persecuting those heretic Christians over there.
Right.
And Jesus says, whatever you do to them, you do to me.
Mm.
That's part of who I am. And I think that's what God had in mind from the very beginning. He wanted to create a community of followers who showed what God is like. I told you, Jesus is the express image of the invisible God. He wants us to know what we should be like and also what God is like. We're not the express image. We're a fractured, stained, mistaken image in many ways. But I think that God takes pleasure in seeing us do in our fumbling, mistake-prone way what God could do just like that with a snap of a finger. That's the pleasure. It's the same pleasure a parent gets when you see your child learn to walk for the first time. There's just nothing better.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think we're missing out on something because God's not in a mountain smoking anymore.
Right.
Well, it didn't really work. It was hard to relate to a mountain smoking, It was hard to relate to a God who was in this holy of holies that the priest only entered one day a year, And we have the presence of God. We have the actual presence of God living in us.
Yeah.
It's a spirit to spirit relationship. And we shouldn't think we're missing out on something. We have the potential for an intimacy that those Israelites in the desert never dreamed of.
Yeah. That's so good. That's really good. Well, I've got one more question for you, Philip. And before I do that, I just want to encourage anybody, if you want to hear more about these topics, then pick up some of these books that we've spoken about. And they're all just amazing works. So invest in those. But I wondered, Philip, if you might just, if you had any kind of word for us in this season. This is such a unique season, isn't it? It's like no other season I've lived through. I think that there are some gains in this season. We can kind of put our heads down and just get through it. But are you sensing the Lord doing anything right now or saying to his church in this season that we should grab a hold of before things start returning? Hopefully not back to complete normalcy, but
right.
Any words of wisdom in this season?
Absolutely. I remember the only time I visited your church in person, Brian, and that was right after the killings at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and the whole nation was grieving and mourning, and of course there in your community it just dominated everything, and it was such a grievously sad time. And I remember saying to the folks that at a time like this, or after September 11, or now we could add the coronavirus pandemic, people are spiritual seeking. And the New York Times even, they don't go to the Richard Dawkins and the Christopher Hitchens at a time like that. Just look at the pages. They go to the N.T. Wrights, they go to the pastors, the rabbis, people like that. And I was listening the other day to a professor from the UK, a Christian professor named John Lennox, and he said last week 25% of people in Great Britain had tuned into a church service. Well, the average church attendance in Britain before this happened was about 5%.
Yeah.
So 5 times as many British people are now actively tuning in with their questions. It's a great time for us to demonstrate what God is like.
Yeah.
So certainly in the middle of the pandemic, what we should do, it's very clear in 2 Corinthians 1, talks about the God of all comfort and the Father of compassion. And if we in the church come away from this time being known as, oh, those are the people who are actually out there doing it. They were showing compassion. They were giving comfort to the people who are locked away in senior citizens facilities, lonely. You know, they found a way to minister to them. That would certainly help.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. We also don't want to return to the same normal.
Yeah.
We want a different normal, because our society is a very divided, fractious, angry society. The voices are shrill.
Yeah.
And I hope that the church doesn't just pick a side and join one of those shrill voices. I hope that we show a different way. I lived through the 1960s, and I was in the South in the civil rights movement era, and there were a lot of angry voices there, but it was really the self-sacrificing, conciliatory voices, Martin Luther King Jr. being the strongest, who got the nation's attention and who made profound changes in our society. And it just, frankly, it shocks me and saddens me that we were reliving some of those things that we thought things had changed. And obviously the spirit doesn't change automatically in a country like ours. But I hope that we can be a voice that shows the way forward, that brings people together instead of dividing them apart. That is certainly the message of Jesus. That's what he brought when he was on earth. And we who claim to be his followers should show that same message.
Yeah, that's great. Those are really, really good words and a good charge to the church in this season, not just in the pandemic, but in our racially divided nation right now. I think those are strong and powerful words as we approach an election. I think those are really good words. We're gonna take those words to heart, Philip. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and thank you everybody for tuning in. We will see you next Tuesday night for our next conversation. Until then, much love to you, and we'll see you soon.